Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Weimar cinema, the incredible creativity that came out of Germany in the 1920s. Our specific film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, one of the greatest of all Expressionist films, and sometimes called the first true horror film. We'll be talking about that and a great deal more after today's screening. Joining us will be noted expert on Weimar cinema, Professor Noah Isenberg. Now enter the very, very Expressionist world of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed this opportunity to see an extraordinary print of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, always talked about as one of the perhaps 100 most important films ever made. Why? That's a good question, and there's many, many answers to that question. We have a good chance at giving a few of them in the next 30 minutes or so. Joining me, once again, happy to have you back, is the Charles Sapp Professor of Radio, Television, and Film of the University of Texas at Austin, Noah Isenberg, who's also the director of the University of Texas at Austin's programs in New York and in Los Angeles. But it's not for his positions, but it's rather for his scholarship. We brought him back because he's the author of books on Casablanca, Billy Wilder, Edgar G. Ulmer, and is also the editor of Weimar Cinema, An Essential Guide. Welcome back, Noah.
Thank you very much, Jerry. It's good to be here.
Good, good. So let's just begin with the simplest of all questions.
Yep.
What was Weimar, the Weimar Republic, and then we'll go on to Weimar cinema.
So the Weimar Republic was Germany's experiment in democracy. It extended from 1919 to Hitler's stunning ascent to power in January of '33. It was a great experiment, not only in democracy, but also in terms of the visual arts. And so the film industry that took root after Germany's defeat,
Right.
Really a traumatic defeat in the Great War, managed to produce some of the most visually stunning and remarkable films of the silent period. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari being, of course, one of the most exemplary, I think, from that period. But the Weimar Republic was, it began in turmoil. You know, a sizable segment of the German voting population was not terribly enamored of the idea of democracy. It began with really a kind of crippling debt to the part of the Versailles Treaty. You had great political turmoil, including a number of acts of political violence, a number of political assassinations. And because of this crippling debt, you had runaway inflation. Right. And so it was definitely a troubling period, but also a very exciting period.
Right.
I mean, you mentioned Billy Wilder, and I think he's a good example of people who made a point of making their way to Berlin during that time. He arrived in June of '26 from Vienna, and many young, he was 20-year-old at that time, and many young creatives, members of what we would call today the creative class, made their way to Berlin. It was affordable. It was sort of a haven of people who came from the stage, came from the visual arts, came from journalism, and there was a great deal of freedom during this period of democracy. And
one way of saying that is that, and this happens in different places at different times, there's actually opportunity in certain kinds of chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's precisely that mix. It's that mix of those who could seize opportunity in this moment of chaos, they thrived. Those who struggled, it was definitely a hard period.
Right.
There were people waiting in lines for food, rations. It was tough, really tough. And that inflation affected people enormously.
Right. And another thing to talk about, to shift a little bit towards Weimar cinema, is that we should always remember that wars closed doors,
Yeah.
so that German cinema
Yeah.
was not an export cinema, even though almost all silent cinemas
Right.
were export cinemas, because all you had to do was change the intertitles. But German cinema, because of the war, had been closed out. So there was great incentive to become
Yeah.
a global export cinema again.
Absolutely, and Caligari is a good case in point in the sense that it was one of many prestige films. It was done for Declo Bioscope. It premiered in February of 2020. It made its way across the Atlantic already within a year. And it was one of those films that just mesmerized, and mesmerized is actually probably a good term.
Right, exactly.
It mesmerized audiences. People were just really captivated by it. I think because of the painted sets, because of this really highly stylized atmosphere that was portrayed
Right.
on screen. You couldn't really do much with a camera at that time, right? It was still chained, essentially.
Right.
But they made up for it in terms of really almost shocking close-ups that were used.
Absolutely.
You think of the close-up on Conrad Veidt as Cesare when his eyes are open, and audiences at that point, we're still dealing with motion pictures, if not in their infancy, they're kind of in their toddler years, more or less, at this point in time. And so I think audiences were not completely, habituated, as it were, to watching horror and
Right.
seeing horror unfold on screen the way that it unfolds on screen in Caligari. And so,
Well, I think you bring up a really excellent point because, again, in this film,
Yeah.
We have a set of techniques that are being used very, very creatively, like the irises
Yeah,
that come
absolutely.
in and out. But that's a kind of older technique
Absolutely.
that's being reinvented in a new way towards Expressionism. But then later, in the Weimar period, we get camera movements that nobody has ever seen before. We get the so-called floating camera.
Right.
And so there's a way in which two things are happening simultaneously during Weimar cinema. One is, artistic creativity, all kinds, like how can we tell the story in a different way that leads, and a lot of those technicians, everybody will remember, end up in Hollywood. So
Yeah.
this has tremendous effect upon Hollywood cinema within the next 25 years after Weimar. But at the same time, there's a very purely producerly reason for this, which is product differentiation. That is, how can we create a different cinema that will have some kind of global appeal that's just not like anybody else? It'll have our stamp on it. Not necessarily a nationalistic stamp, but a stamp of, oh, there's this interesting cinema coming.
Right. I mean, we film historians tend to look at this period through the lens of national cinema, but it was already from the very, very beginnings international in nature. And it's good that you point out. I mean, so Erich Pommer, who was the producer on this film, Conrad Veidt, I already mentioned, who plays Cesare, Hans-Heinrich Twardowski, all these folks would make their way across the Atlantic within, certainly within the decade. And so you're beginning to see, and as I said before, the film itself travels across the Atlantic and is shown here. Virginia Woolf writes about it. A number of people write about it immediately, and they're just kind of wowed by it. As a prestige film, though, and this is what's important, I think, for audiences today, it's not the most representative of what audiences were flocking to see during the Weimar period. Escapist fare, adventure films, romances, generic pictures that were being churned out, well, especially quickly and with really high production values at UFA Studio within the next several years. But a film like Caligari is taken for, it's seen as coterminous with Expressionist cinema. I mean, people think of it as Expressionist cinema. And there is something that is inherently Expressionist about the film, no doubt. Whether it's again, I mentioned a little bit the painted sets, the chiaroscuro lighting, you mentioned the iris. And again, it's interesting to think that the iris, of course, is very kind of rudimentary principle of filmmaking from its infancy. Is re-employed here to dramatic effect, especially on these almost choke close-ups that you get.
Absolutely correct.
And so I think, for audiences today, those who maybe have watched Babylon Berlin on Netflix and I think now the fourth season, if I'm not mistaken, is on Amazon. But anyway, we've watched that very expensive, that lavish television production. They can see, I think, certain flickers of what's on display in Robert Wiene's film of 1920. You can see the war trauma
Right.
That the police inspector, the lead of Babylon Berlin, Gerion Rath, is of course coming to terms with the trauma that he experienced on the front. And I think a lot of that is, if not explicit in Wiene's film, it's kind of undergirding it all. I think that element of trauma, the claustrophobia.
Right, absolutely.
All of that is very much kind of replicating that experience of trench warfare.
Well, it's very interesting that you bring that up, because then I'll just throw one more out there, is the remake very recently of All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about these films is that they are direct representations. That is, you have the direct representation in All Quiet, and very powerfully so recently, of what trench warfare was like. Very much lost to us, I think, these days, unless you're a big fan of Paths of Glory by Stanley K. Kubrick. But then, in the Netflix series, the way in which what we would now all of us call post-traumatic stress disorder is up front, and we understand it as that. What's interesting about this film is that it's there, but it's not. There's no, because of the setting of the film. There's no reference to World War I. But for the historically situated audience, that war is right there when you're watching it.
Absolutely. So it's anti-representational in many respects. I mean, that's the kind of expressionist crux of the whole picture. I think that, and then that element of madness. And in fact, one of the contemporary critics wrote that basically to be mad is to enter into that expressionist universe, so to speak. That madness is a constitutive element of expression, of what's being depicted and what's being experienced internally. And much of it is kind of an inward turn into the psyche of Werner Krauss's, Caligari, the titular character in the film, but also, of course, Cesare, of Jane, of Francis, this confrontation with an element of madness that's beyond anyone's control. And look, the way that the story is told, so you have and by the way, the two screenwriters, so I need to reference them. Let's name check them. Hans Janowitz, who was a Prague-born writer, and Karl Mayer, who was born in Graz in Austria, they had both experienced the war. And so I think audiences, when whether it was there at the premiere in February of 2020 or when it went to general release, they were still very much coming to terms with that. You mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, there were so many war cripples who were in the streets of German cities, and in particular Berlin. And you have, and I reference Babylon Berlin because I think it's really, really well done, but also I think it does a nice job of showing how impactful the Great War was on the German population, in particular this police inspector, Gerion Rath, who's really, he has these almost kind of flashbacks, and he's self-medicating with morphine. I think that what Robert Wiene and company are doing in Caligari is conjuring up that world of madness that soldiers experienced on the front and that the larger population experienced at home.
And that, in a certain sense, people are walking around with invisibly.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of, I mentioned mesmerized, but in this kind of, sleep-like trance. It was, I think it's Lotte Eisner, who together with Siegfried Krakauer, one of the early pioneers of scholars of Weimar cinema, it's in her The Haunted Screen from '52, I think it was, where she talks about this demonic Freudianism, is the way that she puts it, that sort of laced into the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. I mean, Krakauer, of course, in his slightly, well, let's remove slightly for now, tendentious approach to the period, and that it's a foreshadowing of things to come. He sees that Caligari has a lot in common with the fascist. There are certain affinities with the fascist regime as well.
Well, I think it's one of those works that 100 years later is very difficult to pin down. There's no single interpretation of this film, and that's part of the way the film is structured aesthetically, to say, okay, so I can, I'm going to be the imaginary person here. I can read it backward into the war, but if I am fearful of what the Weimar Republic, how it collapse or what could become of it, I can see this as a film that is meant to be prophetic, in some way. I tend, by the way, myself, I tend to go back to it being a response to this whole notion that we're living in a traumatized society that is rebuilding itself, trying to look normal, but there is something internally that is churning in virtually everyone. And so everybody is aware of the madness, but perhaps there's a need for the denial of it.
All of the principles in this film are, on some level, representing that madness. You have Jane, who's walking around in this sleep-like trance. You have, of course, the somnambulist himself, Cesare, who's awakening, and a lot has been, many film historians before me have talked about, to a certain extent, Cesare, who awakens after those years of sleep, is also kind of metacinematic in the sense that he's reflecting upon the medium itself.
Right.
You have, of course, Werner Krauss, who gives a very poised performance as the head of an insane asylum, but also sort of a huckster. He's almost a carnival barker, is the way that he's first introduced to us. And then you have Francis, who kind of unwittingly falls under this spell. And so, I mean, there's a lot that's at work here, but I completely agree with you. I mean, I think one of the ways to understand this film is to do your best to kind of look at it as much as we can do in 2025 through the lens of 1920 and this fledgling democracy, this moment of experimentation, but also, of course, chaos and violence. This moment when there are more libertine ways as well in terms of sexual orientations, the nightlife of the city, which was much more sort of broad-minded, so to speak, than during the monarchy, and much more broad-minded than across the Atlantic as well. And so you had whether it's famously Christopher Isherwood and others who were traveling to Berlin and reporting on it and working it into their own artistry, or was the local population as well. But this was a very exciting time, very youthful time, and I think the cabinet of Dr. Caligari still holds up today, 105 years later, because it also captures this very vulnerable period that we find ourselves in today.
Well, exactly. So the point is that there are historically specific features of trauma, but then there are common features of traumatic experience.
Absolutely.
And so if you're feeling anxious about things and you watch this film, I mean, I think it's one of the perverse ways, I mean that positively, strangely enough, that films can connect with audiences. And that's why people also talk about this, the beginning of the ways in which horror films can address the needs of audiences in all kinds of ways. Well, wait a minute, you're going to the cinema to get scared? Well, then what therapeutic effect does that have in some way? Why do you want to do this? And this is one of the films that kind of initiates this of, well, wait a minute, now I've found, and I'll bring up one of the key words here that's linked to madness, but not exactly the same. But wait a minute, I'm German, but I don't feel at home here in Germany at this particular moment. And then I go to a film, and it's about people who don't feel at home in the town that they're in. And this is one of the films that creates the tradition of representing the uncanny, the not at homeness in cinema that has a legacy.
Unhomely, directly translating from the German.
Unheimlich.
Unhomely. I mean, it doesn't make sense when we call it that, but yes, uncanny is the way that we refer to it. But I think it's really good of you to point out that it's a sort of a skewed or distorted representation of what might otherwise be comforting and home. I don't want to say homely because that has different connotations. But at homeness.
That sense, and we can follow. I think it's important that we can follow a line of that really I think has its origins in the Weimar cinema and very concretely in this film, and that has global impact. I'll even go to say no Caligari, no Mulholland Drive.
Lynch. I think absolutely you could trace the line there. I was thinking when I was mentioning moments ago about this notion of Dr. Caligari, Werner Krauss, the titular character, Werner Krauss figure, as a carnival barker. I think you can trace a line from Caligari to Face in the Crowd, Andy Griffith's character in Face in the Crowd, ace in the hole to a certain extent as well, just in terms of this manipulation
Absolutely.
of audiences. And I think that audiences were, in some cases, if you take Ace in the Hole as an example, people were not ready to be, implicated the way
Right.
that they were. They weren't ready for that skewering of tabloid journalism in that picture. Facing the Crowd, I think Elia Kazan really, took on something that was also in terms of, demagoguery and populism. I'm not sure all audiences were ready for that either. Caligari, look, Germany's still just sort of getting its training wheels on democracy on the ground, and suddenly the world's turned upside down.
Right.
And that's, I think, another, in terms of possible resonances that the film strikes in 2025.
Yeah.
I think that's it as well. Just this trying to come to grips with the world out of joint. So, yes, generically horror film. And certainly it has an element, I mean, I think it was it Deleuze who called sort of a psychoanalytic couch for the poor, that people go to these go to these films in order to kind of deal with their fears, anxieties, fantasies, and so forth. But it's also, I think, in many respects, a political film. I mean, certainly Siegfried Krakauer would have us believe that, but beyond the more tendentious understanding of it, sort of as a preview of coming up. Yeah.
No, but so talk to me more about how you see it as a political film.
Well, I see it as a political film because I think it is commenting, even if obliquely, not explicitly, because it is, I think, very anti-representational and many, anti-naturalistic, but commenting, if only obliquely, if only through these, this shadow play and these painted sets of it. It's commenting on that moment in time. And I think it's commenting on Germany's encounter with democracy in these early days when you had, as I said, everything from runaway inflation, war debt, political chaos, ultimately political violence. That didn't take much longer. It was exactly in the succeeding years. And I think that, that's a lot, obviously. And it's hard to trace precise lines in a film that almost defies.
Give a helping hand
please.
with this. No, but because if we go back to the premise of the fact that this is all happening in some kind of town.
Yeah.
It's not a large city. It's not.
It's
not that. But what is one of the ways that many nations, look nostalgically?
Yeah.
Think of Frank Capra and It's a Wonderful Life.
Sure.
What is it? It is. The real value of the place is in the small town and the small people. And so this uses that bizarrely, but very effectively as a premise, but then puts you in a small town that's like no other small town, that is anxiety-inducing instead of that kind of comforting nostalgia of the romantic view of the small town, of the ideal German town. The ideal German town is full of hucksters, somnambulists, serial killers.
Yeah, it's demonic.
Yeah, it's a demonic small.
And that's the unheimlich. That's the uncanny about it. That's exactly it.
Yeah. Now, I have to just take the moment to pitch one of the other lines of this, and that is a film made by Jerzy Skolimowski in Britain in 1979 called The Shout, which is based upon a Robert Graves short story. But if anybody looks it up, The Shout, starring Alan Bates, John Hurt, and Susanna York, they will say, this is a film that is a framed tale being told at an insane asylum.
Oh, wow.
And then we're in a story that has to do with mystical aspects and the way in which people can be controlled by one another. And so when I've been a huge admirer of that film. I was saying, well, wait a minute, that's another one of these threads that people aren't realizing. This would not happen in this way unless somebody from Central Europe, a Pole like Skolimowski, didn't understand this kind of thing of the uncanny, which is a direct descendant of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
I need to see The Shout. That's a gap. You got me there.
That's right. So then.
Yeah.
We have just about a minute or so left. So what are any of the other things that you would want to draw attention to about, about
Caligari? I don't know. I mean, if we go back to the original question about Weimar.
Please.
I think that Caligari, for better or for worse, remains a touchstone, and one that and you mentioned however much stock one invests in these top 100 or top 10 or top 50 lists, it's always there, and I think it is there for good reason.
Right.
I say for better or for worse because of the point that I tried to make later, which is that I don't really think it's that representative of Weimar cinema writ large, but I do think it is such a quintessential example and a generative example of horror film.
Right.
But I don't want to let go of this notion of it being also very much a political film.
Okay. Happy to hold on to that.
Yeah.
If you'd like our discussion here of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and you'd like to know more about what we do here at CUNY TV and on City Cinematheque, I've got a way for you to find out. Please visit our website. Visit www.tv.cuny.edu. Now, when you go there, you're going to find how you can communicate with us directly at City Cinematheque. Just punch on City Cinematheque. We look forward to your comments. You can also see what we have screened, what we will be screening. City Cinematheque now also has a YouTube channel. Plug that into your favorite search engine, City Cinematheque. And it'll come up, our YouTube channel. There's over 150 different discussions there for you to look at. But there's so many other things for you to look at on CUNY TV as well, and the website's going to guide you to that. Not on cable, away. How would you keep up with things? You can do that too. You can do that with our app. And at the website, you will find a way to get that app, to get it on your mobile device. So visit www.tv.cuny.edu. Noah, always a pleasure having you here. Fun to chat. Look forward to our next chat.
Thank you, Jerry.
Okay.
A real pleasure.
Okay. And thank you for joining us here once again on City Cinematheque as we're exploring for the next couple of weeks Weimar cinema. But always come back and join us as we continue our stroll through the archives of film history. It's bye for now.